Hello, my name is Mr. Tom Froze, and these are my thoughts on illustration. This is a bi-weekly podcast about showing up and growing up as an illustrator. Welcome to episode 12. What's your point? Has anyone ever asked you this, or have you ever asked this to someone else? What do we mean when we ask this question? When someone says something that seems irrelevant, we ask, what's your point? For example, someone might say to me, you know, Tom, you eat a lot of junk food. And so I might ask them back, so what's your point? And what I mean here is, what are you insinuating? What are you trying to say without actually saying it? So we ask this question, what's your point, when we know the person speaking with us is trying to say something, but we need more clarity to make sure we properly understand. So in this silly example of mine, perhaps what this person really means is, Tom, you eat too much crap and you're gaining weight, but they're going about it in a passive-aggressive way. But maybe I've totally misunderstood their point. Maybe what they're really saying is that they wish I'd share my junk food with them. Like maybe what they're really saying is, you know, Tom, you eat a lot of junk food and you never invite me in on the feast. So at times, what people say and what they actually mean are two different things. Their point is unclear because it's veiled in some way. It's not that it's irrelevant, it's just that the meaning isn't presented to us directly or in the clearest possible way. Well, being indirect is probably sometimes necessary. There are times when we just can't say exactly what we mean totally 100% honestly or directly because it would come across as rude or something. But there are times when someone might ask, what's your point? The speaker's just saying lots of words and it seems like they're saying something meaningful, but it doesn't come together in a way we understand. In this sense, we get lost or confused. And this is the sense of the question, what's your point, that I'd like to explore today. So just to be clear, so there's two ways that I'm thinking about when someone might ask the question, what's your point? So the first would be like, you might think that they're insinuating something and you just want to be sure that you've understood what they're saying without saying it. And then the second is just when someone just has a lot of words and they're rambling and you're kind of like, where's this going? What's your point? Where's this going? Now, to be honest, I kind of feel like I'm guilty of doing this to you. I probably do it a lot, but I think I especially did it in the last episode 11. I was having a hard time speaking clearly and concisely about the topic of composition. I was being super rambly, or at least that's the way I feel. But I ran out of time when I was writing the episode, and I just had to go with what I had so I could just get to the video, record it in time I needed to record it in time for my scheduled publication day. So in this case, I had to prioritize getting it done over being perfect. You know, there's this great quote, it's by Mark Twain, and he said, I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one instead. And that is just exactly what happens with me. In order to speak more concisely and edit down my words so they're clear, it takes longer. And that's why it takes me less time to, blab on. Anyway, that's a super side point. But how about a little confession? I need to confess to you that I listen to my own episodes of this podcast after they're published. And while that might seem super narcissistic, it's not because I love hearing myself talk, although I think that's up for debate for anyone who likes to write and speak publicly. But the reason I listen to these podcasts after I publish them is that I like to hear myself from a listener's point of view. There's just something that changes in the way I experience my own content after the episode goes live versus when I'm reviewing it kind of beforehand. By listening after I know others have heard it, I become more aware of this fact and I can evaluate it, like I said, more from a listener's point of view. I think this is just part of being a creative. I do the same thing with my visual work. I intentionally look at my illustrations in their final placement to view them with more critical eyes and to get a more objective sense of how they're working. So anyway, it was in listening to my own episode last week that I could imagine my listeners screaming back to me, Tom, what is your point? I regretted not being more focused and streamlined in my delivery of my subject. And as you'll remember, the subject was composition. Now, I could have said what I needed to say on the topic in less than half the time. I even considered re-recording the entire episode and replacing it altogether, but I resisted because I know that once I start going down that route, I risk becoming overly perfectionistic about this project, this podcast, and it's going to just take over my life. I'm not going to actually have any time to do my actual illustration work. I need to let myself make mistakes and leave them up. These episodes can't all be winners. That's just the reality of making stuff on the regular. That's the reality of showing up. You're going to make stuff you love, and you're going to make stuff you regret. I choose to leave my mistakes up and trust that overall, I'm getting better at this. But getting back to my point, I was thinking about this saying, what's your point? Because it contains something profoundly true. What is a point but a dot? It's this singular point of focus where there's nothing but that one thing. And I'm kind of obsessed with this idea of the one thing. I'm kind of a one thing addict. I hate complexity. I hate decisions. As someone with ADHD, I get completely exhausted by the mental energy it takes to focus and make decisions. So I naturally build systems in my life to avoid these as much as I can. What I really aim for in so much of my work, even if I often fail at getting it, is to have the one thing I'm trying to say come through clearly over everything else. So what is my point here? I'm going to get into it after a few short words. If you like what you hear in today's episode, you can support me by following me and rating and reviewing this podcast wherever you happen to be listening from. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe and let me know in the comments about how this episode helped you today. You can also support me on Patreon, where you can get exclusive access to my live monthly drawing meetups and more. Join today at patreon.com/TomFroze. Another way you can support my podcast is by going to tomfroze.com to join my mailing list. Just scroll all the way to the bottom of the homepage on my website to sign up. Feel free to browse around my shiny new website while you're at it. It's a labor of love, and I'm pretty proud of it. Okay, so what's my point? At one point in your life, you've probably tried to start a fire with a magnifying glass. What does this look like? Well, we go outside on a clear day, it's sunny, and we hold a magnifying glass over a leaf or other non-living object, because I've never ever tortured ants on my driveway in my life. And we focus the sunlight to a single point until we start seeing smoke. When we can focus the sunlight through the glass into that most singular point of light, we get a fire. The power of focus is that we can take some of that proverbial sunlight, which is all around us, and somehow channel it, just some of that light, into a single point that can start a fire. When you think about it, sunlight is all around us. It's everywhere, shining on everything. We're not taking all the sun's energy here to create this little fire. We're simply using that which happens to be around us, where we are in that moment. And by giving it focus, it becomes more powerful and even dangerous. We can use that focus for good or for bad, on purpose or by accident. And to me, this illustration of a magnifying glass demonstrates the power of focus, which, yes, applies to our art, but it also applies to pretty much everything else. Sometimes I use this metaphor of the magnifying glass when I'm talking about how to choose a career path, or as illustrators, how to find our style. when we can find a way to focus just a part of who we are and what we can do, we can become more powerful at that thing. Now, I don't mean powerful in a greedy, power-hungry way, but just in the sense that we can be as effective as we can possibly be. Just like all the sunlight around us, which for the most part is harmless and ineffectual, it's not doing anything in terms of like something that we can sense. We all have all this potential, but none of it can be harnessed until it's focused. So what's my point here? It's focus that helps us achieve a task. It's focus that helps us order different ideas and symbols together to make a point. It's the point that people are then able to see and understand. Because when we try to say and do everything without focusing it around a point in some way, we might as well be saying nothing at all, because few, if any, will be able to understand it. Having a focus is key to being able to do anything well. It helps us make decisions about what to include in our work and what we want others to pay attention to. The focus helps us know what we're saying, and it results in a message others know how to understand. In this metaphor of the magnifying glass, we have different parts. We have the sun, we have the magnifying glass and the lens. And then we have, of course, this point of light and the thing that gets set on fire and all that. But what is this magnifying glass? What is the lens in this analogy? Well, I would say that the glass itself, the thing through which everything else is focused, is our intention. This is what I started talking about last time, and I'm still kind of stuck on it. So I'm dwelling on it a little bit more today, but I think it's really important to have this intention, and that's what helps us focus all the everything, whatever it is, to some kind of focused point. To have a point is to have an intention, and honestly, that's really going to be the foundation of every other decision you make in a work of art. This idea keeps coming back to me to the point where I feel like I'm probably starting to sound like a broken record. I talked about it in episode 6 when we looked into the question of whether our art is good or not. I didn't use the word intention, but I probably mentioned something about purpose. It's the same thing. We need to know what we're trying to do with our work, and that will inform all the other decisions that go into it, including the composition, which was the topic of last episode in which I'm supposed to be talking about today. So if you get anything out of any of this, just remember, have an intention and make all your decisions based on whether they help or hurt said intention. So I kind of promised I'd give you my most breakthrough tips for composition today, but I'm going to be honest, I just keep getting stuck in the weeds. It's something I know I have a lot to talk about or say about, but this podcast doesn't seem to be the place to say it. Composition is just so visual that it just makes more sense for me to save this conversation for my upcoming Skillshare class. I could probably list all the things I know here about composition, like grouping and grids and alignment and stuff like that. But unless there's some kind of focused idea that I can help you remember it by, I think it's just going to fall flat. And that's why when I listened to my episode, like the last episode, I couldn't get through it. I found it, honestly, I'm being hypercritical here, but I found it unbearable. It was just like a lot of information, but it lacked structure. It was kind of like, a tiny little kid wearing adult's clothes. There's just too much clothes for the kid. The kid being, the lack of structure, I guess. What I'm trying to say is it was just a lot of information and it wasn't holding together. It was too floppy. And again, I tend to be super hypercritical and I guess that's just part of like my drive to have this singular focus in the things that I'm creating. So for the rest of this episode, I'm just going to finish my thought here on having a point, because I promise I do have a point. And well, I'm going to take you as far as I got myself, and maybe next time I'll figure out how to talk about this composition stuff in an interesting audio-only way. But for now, I'm afraid I'm just not ready. So I ask your forgiveness for overpromising in the last episode, but I invite you to believe with me that it's all for the better. So to take this home, I've already talked to death about having an intention in our work. What I ended up realizing, though, was that really at the heart of any great composition is a sense of unity. Since composition literally is about how different elements come together on the page to create a single image, it really does come down to how united all those elements are. If there's unity, the composition holds together. If there's disunity, the composition falls apart. You can see this at play in almost every aspect of life. We see this right now in politics as people struggle to find common ground on important issues. I'm no expert in these things, but I assume that if everyone had the same overall goal or focus, there would be far less conflict. Even when we can't make up our own minds on certain issues, we say, I am of two minds. We are divided against ourselves. It's like our brains split apart and they no longer act as one unit. Now, this idea of the power of unity reminds me of the old Sunday school story of the Tower of Babel, where the Babylonians wanted to build a great tower with its top reaching the heavens. In this story, God thwarts their effort by confusing their language so they can no longer understand one another. So according to the book of Genesis, the Babylonian tower was never completed and the people were scattered all over the face of the earth. And this happened as a result of the fact that they no longer spoke one language. They were no longer united. Now, I'm not entirely sure what the main point of this story is, but I do understand the principle that if this ancient civilization was going to achieve its singular goal, which was to create a tower so high that its top tickled the feet of God in heaven, they needed to be united. This was made clear in the story by the point that they all spoke one language, like I said. It was through this unity that they could even dare to do something so audacious. If they couldn't speak the same language, they wouldn't be able to achieve their lofty plans. The story ends with the tower remaining incomplete, and the people of the earth were scattered and they all became different nations. If there is disunity, the composition falls apart. Whatever it is that we want to do in our art, all the separate parts must work together to do that. Even if our goal is to create art that feels disharmonious or disunited even, unless we unite all the parts of our work toward this purpose, we may not see the result we want. Whether you're working with balance, contrast, positive and negative space, texture, color, or any other element or principle of composition, the ultimate artistic goal is to make them feel like they're not just on the page, but a part of it. And they're not just together in the composition, but they're integral and inseparable from one another. To have unity is to let all the separate parts coexist as themselves while also feeling equally part of the same picture. We tend to hyper-focus on one big element or the thing we're most excited to draw in our illustration, but then we ask, what about everything else? How does this thing sit on the page, or how does it relate to the other things that might go with it? A lot of us, I know, struggle with filling in a background behind our main object. When we think more in terms of unity, we can start to see all the things in an illustration as part of an ecosystem. While maybe one thing is the most important in terms of its visual weight, it can only mean what it's meant to mean in relation to all the other things in the composition. A composition then is not just a bunch of separate pieces coming together, but a brand new, singular, or one thing. It's become greater than the sum of its parts. Through a careful assembly of all these different parts coming together around a common intention, it transcends what it used to be. You can feel it when you see it. It holds together as more than just a bunch of stuff you put on the page. This is what I aim for in my work, to feel like I've created something that is so united that it has come alive. So I know I've mixed a few metaphors here, like the magnifying glass and the Tower of Babel, and even this idea of the human brain. But if you look at all three of these illustrations, if you will, they're all examples of things that gather together the potential of the many and the scattered, and they focus them into a real singular thing. So, for example, the magnifying glass focuses scattered beams of sunlight into a point that can start a fire. In the example of the human brain, our brains have been created to focus something, like one part of everything that's happening all around us, into a single experience. Our brain has evolved to pay attention to one thing, even though there are millions of things going on around us all the time. As illustrators, that's our job. It's to take the multiplicity, all the stuff that's happening, and to focus it through an idea or a perspective or a story. Now, as for the example of the Babylonians, maybe things didn't work out so well for them. Maybe they should have put all that united one language energy into building boats to cross the ocean before Christopher Columbus got there. But, I digress. My point here is spend time with your intention. Know what you want to do and know what you want to say. When you know what you're trying to say in your art will always be on point. Now, before we go, it's time for a little thing that I call listener mail. It's been a while since I've done this. This is where I read and respond to some of your comments that come into me in response to previous episodes. So this comment comes from someone who calls himself SAA, comes through YouTube, and it's in response to episode 9 where I talked about loosening up. So here's what they say. I'm not sure if you've made a video about this yet, but is it possible to discuss what to do when you already have a style you like, but you don't know which one to choose? What I mean is, I notice that I go between 3 styles of drawing, but I just can't get myself to stick to one of them. I've tried merging them, but I think I'm not skilled enough yet. And at this point, this person lists the 3 styles they like to work in, and then they continue. I just become paralyzed with choosing one of these styles, let alone sticking to digital or traditional tools. At the moment, though, digital gives me convenience and ease. Mine is still trying to figure out how to achieve the textures I want to. So SAA, I appreciate your question. And yes, I have made a video on this topic. I actually made an entire class. It's called the Style Class. It's on Skillshare. So if you're really struggling with choosing one style or merging your styles, I believe that you will love the Style Class. The Style Class really addresses a lot of these questions that you're asking, especially around commitment and consistency and how to find the one that you feel is truest to you. So you can find that class at my website, tomfroze.com/teaching. It's called the Style Class. But I'll provide an answer here also. And the thing about choosing a style, it does really come down. It actually relates a lot to what I'm talking about today, where it's like about having a focus. There's all kinds of things we could choose to do out there. We could do anything. We could probably illustrate in any style we want to if we worked hard enough at developing it. The question I ask myself in choosing the style that I've kind of narrowed down to is what works best for me most of the time. So I love to draw by hand, for instance, and draw from observation. So I do that almost every day in my sketchbook. But that style that I work in doesn't really work commercially. I need a style that's more about ideas so that I can translate messages or concepts in a way that's easy for other people to understand. It looks nice and it works within whatever context it's supposed to work in. And so I've chosen to focus the skills and abilities and the things that I'm able to do as an illustrator around this kind of problem. How can I represent ideas clearly through illustration? If I was always drawing by hand, for instance, and always relying on observational drawings, drawing from references or from life, I would always need to have the perfect reference in order to, convey the idea. And also, some ideas need more complexity or more complex solutions to be conveyed at all. You can't always represent a concept just by drawing a thing that you see in real life, if that makes sense. So it just so happens that, for me, working in a more flat and stylized way, just for instance, is easier to draw in a more symbolic way. And I need to draw in a more symbolic way in order to convey ideas in a more sophisticated way. And then apart from that, maybe one of the problems you're having is just choosing which one you like. Maybe all of the styles you like are good at drawing in symbolic ways, and you still just don't know which one to choose. Surely you must have one that you like more than the other, so that's the first question I would ask is where it comes, if you had to choose, if you were up against the wall and you had to choose, which style do you like the most? So that's one question. Another question is, which style works for you most of the time? If you're illustrating commercially or whether you're doing self-assigned projects, which one do you think works the most for the kind of visual problems you like to solve? Some styles are better at conveying, say, realism or likeness of people, and other styles are better at conveying ideas. And so sometimes it's just a matter of saying which one works for most of the kinds of problems that I need to solve. Just to go on a little bit of a tangent here, in some of my classes, I talk about how there's a big difference between drawing simple objects in a flat style and then drawing people. Drawing people and drawing flat objects can feel like two different kinds of illustration problems, because one might be more kind of like, it's easy to draw the shape of a box, for instance, or the shape of a phone or the shape of a coffee cup, versus drawing the more rounded organic shape of a human and getting their likeness and the gestures and stuff like that. And so part of my finding my own style and choosing has been what works best for both of those kinds of problems in a more even way, because I want to have a very consistent style, and I don't want to have like my illustrated objects like mugs or boxes or whatever look like they're from a different style, even if it's a slightly different style than the way I draw my people. So again, I have to find the style and the tools, the techniques, whatever it is, that work best for that kind of situation. So which of your styles does the most? But you could put it in another way. It's like, which one is the most adaptable or flexible? And maybe thirdly, when you're trying to choose your style, I would just say this actually. I think sometimes we feel like we have to commit to one style once and for all, and there's no turning back. And that's just not the case. I think we're evolving people. We're always changing, and just like, life changes, we change, our style should change with us. And I've had the pleasure of watching my own style evolve and develop with me. And sometimes I feel like I get stuck in my style. It's too formulaic. And then I add something new to it. Maybe I experiment with a new texture or a new color, and I just add that one thing into it. It's subtle, and I can kind of keep it growing along with me. So let your style evolve. Don't stick to just a formula, And the other thing is, you can find outlets for the other styles that maybe aren't as useful to you to use them somewhere else. And like I said, I do that in my own work. I have a sketchbook where I'm able to scratch that itch of drawing from life and drawing more observationally, and even using different tools. In my sketchbook, I'm using analog tools. I'm using pencil and Posca paint pens, and I'm drawing from my dad's old slides from his photos right now, and I'm loving that. But I couldn't do that in my commercial work. In my commercial work, I work digitally. I use an Apple Pencil. I use Photoshop. I use my iPad as, all those details. And so I've chosen to make this distinction between my consistent commercial style that I advertise as my thing. This is the most reliable, predictable, in a good sense, tool that I can use for my clients. It's sort of like they see my work and they want me to make something that looks like that. So I know how to do that on repeat over and over again. But that doesn't mean on the side I'm experimenting with other styles. Anyway, I like I said, I really think you'll get a lot out of watching the style class. It covers a lot of what I've said here, of course, and more. So please check it out. Thank you so much for your question. Style's a huge topic for me. I love it. And it really does dovetail into what this whole episode was about. For me, it's really about being this one focused set of things that I can use to convey ideas. And because it can only do certain things, my style can't do everything. It also helps me decide what ideas I can't do. It helps me decide what colors I can't use. So it just is this automatic filter that helps me focus things into a point. So thank you again for your question. I really appreciate it. I love reading your messages. If you want to send me a comment or question, head over to my website at tomfrose.com/podcast and scroll down to the listener mail section. Or if you're watching on YouTube, of course, you can just drop me a line in the comments section. My name is Mr. Tom Froze, and those were my thoughts on illustration. You can find links to all my things at tomfrose.com, including my Patreon, YouTube channel, and Skillshare classes. Remember to rate and review, like, subscribe, follow, tell your friends, and all those lovely things. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. I'll see you in the next one. The music for this podcast was written and performed by Mark Allen Falk. You can find links to his music in the show notes or go directly to his Linktree at linktree/semiathletic. This podcast was written and performed without the aid of artificial intelligence. Adobe Podcast AI was used to improve the sound, and I used Lensa, an AI-based photo app, to make me look more appealing in the YouTube thumbnail photo. Mostly I just use it to do lighting corrections. Today's episode was produced by me, Mr. Lighting Corrections, Tom Froze. Special thanks to my audio video engineer, Mark Allen Falk, for his help on this episode.